Number 1. The Teshik Neanderthal. Child burial. Picture yourself standing inside a limestone cave in southern Uzbekistan in May of 1938. The cave is called Teshik Tash, and it sits at 1,500 meters of elevation in the Baysuntau Range, roughly 125 kilometers south of Samarkand. The Soviet archaeologist Alexei Pavlovich Okladnikov has been scraping back cave sediment for weeks under the authority of the Institute for the History of Material Culture in Leningrad. In Cultural Layer 5, he finds something that should not exist under Stalin's anthropology. A child's skeleton, crushed but recognizable. And around the child, driven point down into the cave floor, a ring of 5 or 6 pairs of Siberian ibex horn cores, arranged as if to enclose the body in a circle of fangs. The skeleton belongs to a Neanderthal boy roughly 8 to 9 years old at death, designated Teshik Tash 1. His skull had been shattered into approximately 150 fragments by a collapsed cave roof. The anthropologist Mikhail Antonovich Gremyatsky at Moscow State University spent years reassembling it, and when he was finished, the reconstructed cranium showed a capacity of approximately 1,490 cubic centimeters. Squarely within Neanderthal range, the Mysterian stone tools found alongside dated the layer to approximately 70,000 years before the present. Okladnikov published the find in his 1949 monograph and argued for deliberate ritual burial. The American anthropologist Hallam L. Movius Jr. supported the interpretation in an influential 1953 paper in American Anthropologist, and then the Soviet machine went to work. The doctrinal problem was simple. Soviet anthropology under dialectical materialism required a developmental sequence in which symbolic behavior, ritual practice, and religious thought emerged with class society. Not before. Neanderthals were supposed to be primitive precursors incapable of ritual life. A child surrounded by deliberately placed horn cores said otherwise. So, the orthodoxy attacked. Yakov Roginsky and Mikhail Nesturk, both leading Soviet anthropologists, argued for decades that the horns were natural accumulation, the work of cave bears or hyenas, food refuse of a predator's lair. Trofim Lysenko's broader assault on biological science in the late 1940s created an atmosphere hostile to any evolutionary interpretation that did not serve Marxist-Leninist ideology, and Neanderthal studies took the collateral damage. The skepticism crossed the Iron Curtain. Robert Gargett's 1989 paper in Current Anthropology revived the cave bear hypothesis from a Western angle. The cause of death of the child himself remained unresolvable. The cranial damage was post-mortem from the roof collapse. Whether the boy was killed deliberately, died of disease, or perished by accident is still unknown. Ancient DNA analysis published in Nature in 2007 finally confirmed that Teshik-1 carried Neanderthal mitochondrial lineage, ending decades of debate about whether the skeleton was even Neanderthal. Micro-CT scans of the surrounding sediment published in 2013 and 2017 confirmed the angular distribution of the horn cores was non-random and inconsistent with natural deposition. The child had been buried with care. The horns had been placed. The orthodoxy had been wrong for 50 years. Number 2. The Pazyryk, Scalped Chief, and Frozen Sacrifice Tombs. Move forward in time to 1947, 1,600 meters up in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia. The Soviet archaeologist Sergei Ivanovich Rudenko is opening the second of 5 massive kurgans clustered in the Pazyryk Valley. The kurgans date to between the 5th and 3rd centuries before the Common Era, attributed to Iron Age Scythian-related nomadic populations. Beneath the heaped stone cairns covering each tomb, the cold conducted downward through the rocks has formed a permafrost lens. Inside that lens, organic material is intact. What Rudenko finds in Kurgan 2 is a man whose skull cap has been sawn off. The chief's body is preserved with skin, hair, internal organs, and tattoos still visible. His scalp has been removed in a single piece. The bone of his skull has been trepanned with copper blades along a circular line above the brow, and the entire calvarium lifted away. His brain has been extracted. The hollow cavity has been packed with conifer needles, dried grass, and soil. His chest has been opened in similar fashion, the muscles and internal organs removed, and the thoracic cavity filled with grasses and aromatic herbs. Then the skull cap has been replaced. The scalp has been pulled back over the wound. Across the chief's surviving skin curl blue-black tattoos. A stag with antlers transforming into bird heads. A griffin attacking a deer. twisted hybrid beasts crawling up his arms and across his shoulders. They are the oldest preserved figurative tattoos on a human body anywhere in the world. In a separate northern compartment of the tomb, Rudenko finds 10 horses, each killed by a single blow to the skull with a pickaxe or war hammer, each elaborately equipped with carved wooden saddles, felt blankets, and gold leaf bridles. One horse is wearing a leather mask shaped to resemble a reindeer with antlers. Kurgan 5, also excavated by Rudenko, it contains a male-female double burial. The female has been embalmed and tattooed by the same technique. The tomb also contains the Pazyryk carpet, a pile-knotted woolen rug dated to approximately 400 before the Common Era. It is the oldest surviving pile-knotted carpet in the world. Rudenko published his findings in 1953 in the monograph Kultura Naselenia Gornogo Altaya Skifskoye Vremya. The publication was heavily edited, the violence of the horse killings was softened, the symbolic implications of the tattoos were minimized. The body of the chief was framed as an elite mummification rather than as evidence of a ritual practice involving violation of corpses. The full picture did not reach Western audiences until M.W. Thompson's 1970 English translation appeared as Frozen Tombs of Siberia. Throughout the Cold War, Soviet authorities restricted Western access to the Pazyryk material at the Hermitage Museum, citing preservation concerns. The tattoos remained largely unstudied in detail until Russian researchers applied infrared photography in 2004 and revealed previously invisible designs covering an additional 30% of the chief's skin. Forensic reanalysis of the skull in 2018 confirmed the trepanation was performed post-mortem with copper-bladed tools as part of a standardized embalming procedure. In 1993, Natalia Polosmak excavated the Ukok princess on the Ukok Plateau and found another tattooed and embalmed Pazyryk female, confirming the elite tradition. What Rudenko had documented in 1947 was not an isolated ritual. It was a culture. Number 3, the Arzhan, 1 Kurgan, 160 horse sacrifice. 20 years after Rudenko closed Kurgan II, the Soviet archaeologist Mikhail Petrovich Gryaznov began an excavation in the Uyuk Valley of the Tuva Republic in southern Siberia. The site was a vast circular mound near the village of Arzhan, 120 meters in diameter and originally 4 meters tall. Constructed of larch logs and stone, from above it resembled a wheel. Inside, 70 radial wooden chambers arranged like the spokes of that wheel surrounded a central burial chamber. Dendrochronological dating of the larch timbers placed the construction at approximately 800 before the Common Era. That made Arzhan I the earliest known Scythian-type royal kurgan in all of Eurasia. The tradition Rudenko had documented at Pazyryk did not start in Pazyryk. It started here, in Tuva, 300 years earlier. Gryaznov spent 3 years excavating, between 1971 and 1974. What he recovered staggered the limits of comparable archaeology. Approximately 160 horses, all killed by blows to the skull, arranged in the radial chambers with elaborate harness equipment of bronze, bone, and antler. Isotopic analysis of the horse's teeth published in 2017 by Russian and German researchers revealed that many of the horses had been brought from herds hundreds of kilometers away, as tribute or as ritual sacrifice. The kurgan was not just a tomb, it was a regional offering. The central chamber held the chief and his consort, both adorned with the gold ornaments. Looters had reached the chamber in antiquity and removed much of the treasure. But around them, in the spoke chambers, Gryaznov also recovered the remains of at least 17 sacrificed humans, retainers, attendants, perhaps war captives. Every one of them showed peri-mortem trauma consistent with deliberate killing. None of them died of natural causes. The harness fittings carried the early Scythian animal-style art that would echo across the Eurasian steppe for the next 1,000 years. Curled feline predators, ungulate prey in dynamic combat scenes. The artistic vocabulary that Western art historians had attributed to the Western Pontic steppe was now demonstrably born in southern Siberia, in this valley, in this period. Gryaznov published the findings in 1980 in the Soviet monograph Arzhan, Tsarsky, Kurgan, Raniskivskogo, Vremeny. Restricted print run, limited Western distribution. Throughout the Soviet period, Western archaeologists did not receive systematic access to the Arzhan I material. The Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg holds the surviving artifacts, including the largest collection of early Scythian gold and bone-carved harness fittings ever excavated from a single context. The 17 sacrificed humans were largely overlooked in Soviet publications, which emphasized artistic and horse sacrifice aspects. Reanalysis of the human remains in 2015 by Russian bioarchaeologists confirmed perimortem cranial fractures consistent with ritual killing rather than battle wounds. Konstantin Chigunov's excavation of Arzhan II between 2000 and 2003 recovered an intact royal burial with over 9,000 gold artifacts and additional sacrificed horses and humans. Together, the two Arzhan Kurgans established Tuva as the heartland of the Scythian elite mortuary tradition. The political inconvenience of demonstrating that elaborate barbaric ritual flourished inside Soviet territory thousands of years before Russian civilization had its own kept the site underpublished until the 1990s. 25 years of delay. Number 4. The Cucuteni Trypillia mass house burnings. Move from one Kurgan in Tuva to an entire civilization spread across Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine. The Cucuteni Trypillia culture flourished between approximately 5500 and 2750 before the Common Era. The type sites are Cucuteni in Romania, excavated by Teodor Burada in 1884, and Trypillia in Ukraine, excavated by Vikenty Kvoyka in 1897. The culture predates Soviet science, but Soviet excavation expanded it dramatically across the 20th century. What Soviet archaeologists found in Ukraine was a civilization of megacities. The Talyanki settlement covered approximately 450 hectares with an estimated 15,000 to 21,000 inhabitants at peak. Other megasites included Maidanetske, Nebelivka, and Dobrovudy, each housing populations in the thousands at densities matching early Mesopotamian cities. These were among the largest settlements anywhere in the world during their period, and every one of them had been burned to the ground, not once, cyclically, approximately every 60 to 80 years, for 1,500 consecutive years. The houses were built of wattle and daub with clay-plastered walls and reed-thatched roofs. Soviet excavators noted that the burning intensity was so extreme it vitrified the clay walls into ceramic-like masses. The Russian term for these features was obozheny gliniany ploshchadki, burned clay platforms. Reproducing the temperatures required to vitrify the clay required exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius, which natural accidental fires of wattle and daub structures cannot reach without deliberate addition of fuel and accelerants. The buildings had been deliberately set ablaze with fuel piled inside. Soviet archaeologists working under directives from the Ukrainian SSR Academy of Sciences from the 1930s through the 1980s consistently interpreted the burnings as accidents, as hostile attacks by enemies, or as routine settlement abandonment with subsequent fire. Tatiana Pasyk's foundational 1949 monograph Periodizacja Tripolskich Poselení framed the burnings as evidence of intertribal warfare. The interpretation served Soviet doctrinal needs by attributing the destruction to external forces rather than to ritual self-immolation by ancestral Slavic populations. The deliberate burning interpretation was first systematically proposed by the Lithuanian American archaeologist Marija Gimbutas in her 1991 book The Civilization of the Goddess. The Ukrainian archaeologist Vladimir Krutz in the post-Soviet 1990s and 2000s assembled detailed evidence that the burnings were intentional, the inclusion of valuables left inside the houses, the systematic nature of village-wide destruction, the repeated cycles every 2 to 3 generations. The current consensus among Mikhail Videyko, Alexander Dyachenko, and the Western collaborators John Chapman and Biserka Gaidarska accepts that the burnings were ritualized acts of community-wide destruction. The most disturbing aspect was buried even longer. Human remains have been recovered from burned houses at multiple sites, including at Drutsi and Petreni. Articulated skeletons inside burned house collapse, including children. The Drutsi site preserved a child's body inside a burned structure, suggesting at minimum that not all residents escaped. Soviet-era publications systematically omitted reference to human remains inside burned houses or attributed them to later intrusive burials. The total number of houses burned across the Cucuteni Trypillia distribution over 2,750 years is estimated at over 1 million, the largest sustained ritual destruction event in prehistoric Europe. Number 5. The Sintashta Chariot sacrifice pits move east now, across the southern Ural steppe, into the present-day Chelyabinsk Oblast of Russia. The Sintashta culture flourished between approximately 2200 and 1800 before the Common Era. Its type site sits on the Sintashta River. The site was discovered and excavated by the Soviet archaeologist Vladimir Fedorovich Gening between 1972 and 1987. What Gening found was a fortified circular settlement 140 meters in diameter, surrounded by cemeteries containing several dozen burials. And in those burials, the world's oldest war chariots, true chariots with spoke wheels, light frames, and paired draft horses, dated to approximately 2000 before the Common Era. The chariots predate the Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Chinese, and Indian chariot traditions by hundreds of years. The burial pattern was consistent across the Sintashta cemeteries and across the related sites of Krivoye, Ozero, Kameny, Ambar, and Bersuat Kamisti. A rectangular pit dug into the steppe soil, 2 horse skeletons at one end positioned as if drawing the chariot itself dismantled or compressed at the other end. The human warrior interred between the horses and the vehicle. The horses had been killed by a single blow to the forehead with a hafted bronze axe or stone mace. The killing wound was often visible as a depression fracture on the recovered skulls. The burials did not stop with the warrior, the horses, and the chariot. Several Sintashta chariot pits contain additional sacrificed individuals, children and adolescents interred at the warrior's feet or above his body. The 1992 monograph Sintashta by V. F. Gening, G. B. Zdanovich, and V. V. Gening described the burials in technical detail but framed the human sacrifices as ritual accompaniments rather than as the killings they were. The political reasons for this framing reach beyond simple decorum. The Sintashta culture sits at the genetic root of the Indo-Iranian language family. David Reich's laboratory confirmed this in 2015 through ancient DNA analysis of Sintashta skeletons. The population was a direct ancestor of South Asian Indo-Aryan migrants. The chariots, the bronze weapons, the paired horses, and the elite mortuary practices spread from Sintashta outward across Eurasia within approximately 500 years. The complex reached Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, and the Indian subcontinent. Soviet archaeology, however, was forbidden by political circumstance from publishing this clearly. The reason was that any Indo-European migration interpretation paralleled Western Aryan invasion theories that had been weaponized by Nazi ideology. The Soviet response was to suppress the entire interpretive framework rather than separate the linguistics from the racial pseudo-science. 20 kilometers from Sintashta sits Arzhan, discovered in 1987 by Gennady Zanovich, just before the site was scheduled to be flooded by a planned Soviet reservoir project. Zdanovich organized public protests that successfully canceled the dam and preserved the site. Arzhan and the related country of towns fortresses represent the most concentrated and sophisticated fortified Bronze Age settlement system known from the Eurasian steppe. Bioarchaeological reanalysis of the Sintashta human remains in 2018 confirmed that multiple individuals showed perimortem trauma consistent with deliberate killing. The Chariot Revolution had begun with sacrifice pits, and the sacrifice pits had been quietly hidden for 40 years. Number 6. The Mezhirich 149 Mammoth Slaughter Dwelling. Travel back in time 14,000 years. Cross the Rose River in central Ukraine near the village of Mezhirich in the Cherkasy region. A Ukrainian farmer named V. P. Novitsky is digging a cellar in 1965. His shovel strikes bone. Enormous bone. He clears the earth back and finds himself looking through an arched doorway framed by interlocking mammoth tusks. The site Novitsky discovered was an upper Paleolithic dwelling constructed entirely from mammoth bones. Excavations from 1966 onward, led by Ivan Pidoplichko and later by Mikhailo Ladkik of the Ukrainian SSR Academy of Sciences, expose a structure approximately 5 meters in diameter, dome-shaped, with no other structural materials in the load-bearing framework. The construction required an estimated 21 tons of mammoth bone, the bones of at least 149 individual mammoths. The architecture was deliberate and sophisticated. 95 mammoth mandibles arranged interlocking around the base in a herringbone pattern, forming the foundation. skulls, scapulae, pelvises, and long bones arranged above. The entrance framed by mammoth skulls with intact tusks forming a natural arched doorway. 3 more dwellings of similar construction were excavated nearby. The community at Mezhirich numbered approximately 40 to 60 people across the 4 structures, occupied across a window of approximately 200 years between 14 and 15,000 years before the present. Soviet interpretation under Pitoplichko emphasized that the bones could have been gathered from natural mammoth death sites and accumulations rather than representing systematic hunting kills. This scavenge bones interpretation was politically convenient. It avoided implying that prehistoric humans had driven mammoth populations toward extinction through overhunting. The doctrinal preference for harmonious human-environment relations in pre-class societies could be preserved. The American archaeologist Olga Sofer published her analysis of the Russian Plain mammoth record in 1985 in the Upper Paleolithic of the Central Russian Plain. She demonstrated that the freshness and articulation of the recovered bones indicated active hunting rather than scavenging. She further demonstrated that mammoth populations of the Russian Plain showed a clear demographic crash coincident with Upper Paleolithic human occupation. The animals had not died of natural causes. Humans had killed them, systematically, across centuries. Associated artifacts at Mezhirich included ivory carvings, bone tools, drilled fox teeth, and shell ornaments imported from over 800 kilometers away. A schematic map drawn on a mammoth shoulder blade recovered from the site is interpreted by some researchers as one of the world's oldest cartographic representations, possibly depicting local rivers or hunting territory. Refined radiocarbon dating in 2010 by Russian and Western collaborators confirmed the occupation window. The total estimated mammoth bone usage across all known late Pleistocene dwelling sites in Ukraine and southern Russia, including Mezin, Udinovo, Kostenki, Pushkari, and Eliseyevichi, approaches the bones of 2,000 individual mammoths. Soviet doctrine wanted humans living in harmony with megafauna. The bones told a different story for 50 years, and almost no one in the West was permitted to hear them. Number 7. The Maikop Kostromskaya retainer sacrifice tomb. Travel to the North Caucasus of present-day southern Russia to the Krasnodar Krai region. The Maikop culture flourished between approximately 3,700 and 3,000 before the Common Era. The type site is the Maikop Kurgan, excavated in 1897 by Nikolai Veselovsky on commission from the Imperial Archaeological Commission. The excavation predates the Soviet period, but the Maikop material was extensively reanalyzed under Soviet science across the 20th century. Veselovsky's most disturbing excavation that same year was at Kostromskaya Stanitsa, a stanitsa village in Krasnodar Krai. The kurgan there stood approximately 8 meters tall and 50 meters in diameter. Beneath the earthen mound, Veselovsky cut down through layers of clay and stone and exposed a central wooden tent-like burial chamber. Inside that chamber, a male skeleton interpreted as a chieftain or elite warrior, surrounded by what was clearly a designed arrangement. Approximately 22 human skeletons, multiple horses, at least 4 bulls, all sacrificed. The retainers included individuals of various ages and both sexes. Several showed signs of strangulation or blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with ritual killing. The chief lay at the center of a circle of bodies and a circle of grave goods. The grave goods themselves were spectacular. Extensive gold ornaments, including stamped gold appliques in animal-style art depicting lions, bulls, and stylized rosettes. The Maikop material presaged later Scythian artistic traditions by 2,000 years. The Maikop culture is now understood as a major innovator in metallurgy. It produced among the earliest tin-bronze artifacts in the world. Its elaborate goldwork influenced later Eurasian metalwork traditions across centuries. DNA analysis of Maikop skeletons published in 2018 by Wolfgang Hock and collaborators revealed that the Maikop population had close genetic affinities to Mesopotamian and Anatolian Neolithic groups rather than to surrounding steppe populations. The culture sat at a node in long-distance exchange networks connecting the Caucasus to Mesopotamia. Imported lapis lazuli from Afghanistan and silver from Anatolia have been found in elite burials. The Kostromskaya material is housed in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, where it was extensively studied during the Soviet period. The principal Soviet researchers, Alexander Essen and later Rauf Munchiev, consistently emphasized the artistic and metallurgical significance of the find while downplaying the retainer sacrifices. Munchayev's 1975 monograph Kavkaz Neizardi Bronzovogo Veka presented the Kostromskaya material in technical detail but minimized comparisons to ritual sacrifice elsewhere in the ancient world. The reason was political. Soviet ideology preferred to celebrate the artistic and economic sophistication of indigenous Eurasian populations while suppressing evidence of elite brutality that might be read as a reflection of contemporary Soviet hierarchy. The retainer sacrifice tradition at Kostromskaya represents one of the earliest documented examples of elite human sacrifice in Eurasian prehistory. It predates the Mesopotamian royal cemeteries at Ur by approximately 1,000 years. Reanalysis of the Kostromskaya skeletons in 2010 by Russian bioarchaeologists confirmed that multiple individuals showed perimortem trauma patterns consistent with deliberate ritual killing. The Maikop Kurgan tradition spread across the North Caucasus and into the southern steppe, influencing the later Yamnaya and catacomb cultures that gave rise to Indo-European pastoral expansion. The Krasnodar regional museums and the Hermitage hold extensive collections that remained largely inaccessible to Western researchers until the 1990s. Number 8. The Botai industrial horse-killing floors. The final atrocity comes from northern Kazakhstan. From a steppe valley near present-day Akmola region, the Botai culture flourished between approximately 3700 and 3100 before the Common Era. The type site of Botai was discovered and excavated beginning in 1980 by the Soviet Kazakh archaeologist Viktor Fyodorovich Zybert of the Kokshetov Pedagogical Institute. The site covered approximately 15 hectares and contained the remains of approximately 158 semi-subterranean pit houses with packed earth floors and timber frame roofing. What Zybert found within and beneath those houses defies easy comprehension. The bones of approximately 300,000 individual horses, 300,000, deposited in dense bone beds throughout the settlement. Bone bed thickness reaching multiple meters in concentrated deposits. The horse bone density at Botai exceeds that of any other prehistoric site in the world. The earth itself, for tens of meters in every direction from the houses, was packed with horse skeletal remains. The site's significance for the global story of horse domestication was confirmed by Alan Outram and collaborators in a 2009 paper in Science. They identified bit wear on the premolar teeth of Botai horses, providing the earliest unambiguous evidence for horse riding and domestication anywhere in the world at the time of publication. The same study identified mare's milk residues on Botai ceramic vessels, demonstrating dairy use and confirming domestic relationships with horses beyond simple hunting. The Botai people have been riding horses and drinking mare's milk roughly 5,500 years ago, the earliest known horse domestication on Earth. But subsequent ancient DNA analysis by Ludovic Orlando's laboratory in 2018 revealed something more complicated. The Botai horses were not the ancestors of modern domestic horses. They represented an independent domestication that left no modern descendants. The Botai horse population was a dead-end branch, eventually replaced by a separate domestication event from Western Eurasia that produced the horses we know today. The narrative of pastoral domestication, however, does not explain the bone beds. The sheer scale of horse slaughter at Botai, including extensive evidence of young horses killed before reproductive age, is more consistent with industrial slaughter complexes than with balanced pastoral economy. The bone beds include systematic butchery cut marks indicating organized mass processing of carcasses. The horse bones at Botai significantly outnumber the resident human population. Horses were brought from external sources for slaughter, not just bred and managed on site. The packed earthen floors of the houses were mixed with horse manure and slaughter debris, indicating that domestic life was conducted on top of and surrounded by industrial-scale animal processing. Soviet interpretation under Zybert and the broader Soviet archaeological establishment framed Botai as a story of peaceful pastoral domestication. Zybert's 1993 monograph, In Neolith Uralo Irtishskogo Mezhirich, emphasized cultural sophistication and downplayed the violence of horse processing. The Botai material remained largely inaccessible to Western researchers until the post-Soviet 1990s. The total horse death count at Botai over its approximately 600-year occupation is estimated to exceed 500,000 animals. One of the largest sustained animal killing events documented anywhere in prehistory, framed for 40 years as a triumph of harmonious domestication. The pattern across all 8 atrocities is too consistent to be accident. Soviet archaeology systematically suppressed, distorted, or quietly omitted findings that contradicted official ideology. Understanding how the suppression machine actually worked requires looking past the individual sites to the doctrinal framework that produced them all. Soviet anthropology operated under the requirements of dialectical materialism. Friedrich Engels's 1884 work, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, served as the foundational text imposed on the field. Engels argued that complex symbolic behavior, ritual practice, religious thought, and social hierarchy emerged with the rise of class society. Not before. The implication for prehistoric archaeology was direct. Neanderthals and Paleolithic humans could not have had complex ritual life. Pre-class Neolithic societies could not have practiced elaborate sacrificial violence. Bronze Age elites were primitive predecessors of true civilization, not its full participants. The doctrinal pressure was compounded by Trofim Lysenko's takeover of Soviet biology in the late 1940s. The 1948 Vosknai L session formally banned Mendelian genetics and forced ideological conformity across the biological sciences. Lysenko enjoyed protection from Stalin and later Khrushchev, distorting Soviet biology until his removal in 1965. The chilling effect spread beyond genetics. Any evolutionary interpretation that did not serve Marxist-Leninist ideology was treated with suspicion. Cross-contamination into archaeology meant that interpretations of fossil and skeletal material had to fit Marxist developmental schemas. The Mars School of Linguistics imposed parallel ideological constraints on language origins until Stalin's 1950 reversal demonstrated the volatility of imposed orthodoxy. The pattern was the same. Doctrinal frameworks shifted with political winds, but the requirement of ideological conformity remained constant. Researchers learned to self-censor before publication. Editorial intervention at Soviet academic journals removed politically inconvenient interpretations. The Institute for the History of Material Culture in Leningrad functioned as central gatekeeper for Soviet archaeology, with peer review operating as ideological screening rather than scientific evaluation. Scholars who pushed back faced imprisonment, exile, or professional erasure. The atmosphere after the 1937 Great Purge silenced dissent in academic life, and self-censorship persisted through the Khrushchev and Brezhnev periods. Ideological constraints loosened only with Glasnost in the late 1980s. Doctrinal suppression was reinforced by structural separation. The Cold War cleaved archaeology into 2 essentially parallel traditions that developed in near-complete isolation from each other for 40 years. The Russian language barrier limited Western access to Soviet archaeological literature. Soviet researchers received filtered access to Western literature through the Unstranye Niji import system. Academic exchanges between Soviet and Western universities were tightly restricted between 1947 and the late 1980s. The Institute for the History of Material Culture controlled foreign access to Soviet excavation sites. Soviet archaeological journals, including Sovetskaya Archeologia and the Materially Isledovania Po Archeologii SSSR series, had limited Western library subscriptions. Translations of major Soviet works into English appeared only with significant delays. M. W. Thompson's 1970 English translation of Rudenko's Pazyryk work was a notable exception rather than the rule. A handful of Western archaeologists built bridges across the wall. Maria Gimbutas, James Mallory, and David Anthony each made careers integrating Soviet territory evidence into Western prehistoric synthesis. Soviet archaeologists building bridges in the other direction operated with more limited freedom. Vasily Alexeyev and Boris Rybakov maintained some contact with Western scholars, but the asymmetry was profound. Western New Archaeology developed in parallel with Soviet historical materialism. Processual and post-processual approaches matured without Soviet input. Soviet methodological strengths lay in ceramics typology, stratigraphic analysis, and museum cataloging. Western methodological advances pulled ahead in radiocarbon dating, isotopic analysis, and residue chemistry. After 1991, Russian archaeologists learned Western methods, Western archaeologists accessed Soviet data, and joint expeditions became possible. The DNA revolution after 2010 finally integrated Soviet-excavated skeletal material into world prehistory, but the integration arrived 20 to 40 years late. The men whose names appear throughout this video did not simply work under Soviet constraints. Several of them actively pushed against the constraints, often at significant personal and professional cost. Alexei Pavlovich Okladnikov trained under the great Soviet anthropologist Mikhail Gerasimov and built his career under Stalin. His publication of the Teshik Tash burial interpretation in 1949 was a calculated risk. He chose to publish despite knowing the ideological reception he would face. Sergei Ivanovich Rudenko had been arrested in 1929 during the Academy of Sciences purge, and spent 7 years in exile before being permitted to resume archaeological work. His careful editorial choices in publishing the Pazyryk material reflected the limits of what he could say after that experience. Mikhail Petrovich Gryaznov navigated Soviet academic politics across a long career and accepted restricted publication of his Arzhan 1 material as the price of being allowed to publish at all. Vladimir Fedorovich Gaining brought the Sintashta material to publication despite the Indo-European political sensitivities surrounding the find. Gennady Zdanovich discovered Arkham in 1987 and organized the public protest that saved it from flooding by the planned reservoir. Ivan Pitoplitko at Mezhirich navigated the politics of Ukrainian SSR archaeology with similar care. Mikhail Fedonkin pushed the discovery of the Vendian biota through Soviet scientific publishing, even when its implications for the origin of complex life were unwelcome. Viktor Zybert excavated Botai in remote Kazakhstan under Soviet logistical constraints. Within academic conferences and doctoral defenses, a community of scholars knew the truth and shared it frankly. Outside those venues, in the printed journals, the truth was filtered. The price paid by scholars who pushed too hard included career stagnation, denied promotions, restricted travel, and exile to provincial institutions. The Samizdat tradition in literature had a counterpart in archaeology, with typewritten manuscripts of suppressed interpretations circulating among trusted colleagues. The post-Soviet rehabilitation of these interpretations began in the 1990s and continues today. The suppression mechanisms were not abstract. They consisted of specific institutional tools applied with bureaucratic consistency. Pre-publication editorial review at Soviet academic presses removed politically inconvenient interpretations from manuscripts before they reached print. The Soviet censorship apparatus, known as Glavlit, extended its oversight into academic publishing alongside fiction and journalism. A common technique was the presentation of raw data without interpretation, allowing facts to be buried in technical form where only specialists would find them, while interpretations remained safely orthodox. Restricted print runs of sensitive monographs limited their circulation to a few hundred copies, ensuring that politically marginal works could not reach a wider Soviet audience or international circulation. The Hermitage Museum and other major Soviet institutions controlled Western access to artifacts and skeletal material directly. Certain finds were classified as militarily or politically sensitive and removed from public catalogs. The KGB monitored foreign scholarly contacts. Soviet visa restrictions limited Western researcher visits to excavation sites, and mandatory minder accompaniment ensured that any visits that did occur produced no unauthorized observations. Career consequences for scholars who pushed back included denied promotion, restricted research budgets, and assignment to provincial institutions far from major libraries or museum collections. The destruction of scholarly reputations through politically motivated denunciation was a documented hazard, and the 1937 Great Purge precedent set the outer limits of acceptable inquiry. Party membership functioned as a prerequisite for advancement, and the selective publication of findings that supported official narratives alongside the complete suppression of findings that contradicted them produced a published archaeological record that systematically distorted the prehistoric reality of Soviet territory. The cumulative consequences of Soviet-era suppression for the understanding of prehistoric Eurasia were profound. The integration of Teshik Tash into the global corpus of Neanderthal mortuary behavior was delayed by approximately 50 years. The recognition of Pazyryk tattoos as the oldest preserved figurative human tattoos waited 30 years for Western audiences to access the full record. The Arzhan 1 Royal Kurgan tradition was unrecognized in Western syntheses until the 2000s. Soviet-era misframing of Cucuteni Trypillia, village burnings as accidents distorted Neolithic ritual studies for half a century. The Sintashta material entered Indo-European migration models only after 2000. Mezhirich and their related mammoth hunting evidence were delayed in megafaunal overkill debates by 20 years. The Maikop sacrificial complex went unrecognized as a precursor to Scythian and broader Indo-European royal sacrifice traditions. Botai horse domestication evidence took 15 years to enter world archaeology after its initial publication. The Vindian Beata of the White Sea, discovered by Mikhail Fedonkin, was separated from the Ediacaran fauna of the Western record for 30 years simply because the two traditions used different names. The Maltese boys' genetic significance for the populations of the Americas waited 80 years between excavation in 1929 and sequencing in 2013. The general pattern was the systematic undervaluation of Soviet territory prehistoric evidence in world syntheses. Western prehistorians overlooked the Eurasian steppe as a major source of innovation. Textbooks misframed chariot warfare as Near Eastern in origin. Horse domestication was attributed to various sites in the Near East before boat recognition. The Aryan invasion controversy was distorted by Soviet political sensitivities. Indo-European migration routes were obscured by suppression of Sintashta and Gerontic and Center Andronovo evidence. The mass house-burning tradition of Cucuteni Trypillia was missing from comparative Neolithic ritual surveys. Neanderthal cognitive evolution debates were conducted without full Teshik Tash evidence. For 2 generations, the picture of prehistoric Eurasia was fundamentally distorted. The recovery of these suppressed findings began with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Joint expeditions became possible. Russian researchers gained access to Western journals. Western researchers gained access to Soviet excavation collections. But the most dramatic recovery has come from the bones themselves. Speaking past the ideological filters of the past through ancient DNA, isotopic, and imaging technologies that did not exist when the original suppressions occurred. The 2007 Teshik Tash DNA work confirmed Neanderthal mitochondrial lineage, ending 60 years of debate. The 2013 Malta Boy genome revealed the ancient North Eurasian ancestry of Native Americans. The 2015 Reich Lab work on Sintashta confirmed the Indo-Iranian ancestry connection. The 2018 Hawk DNA work on Maikop confirmed Mesopotamian and Anatolian affinities. The 2018 Orlando lab work on Botai horses revealed independent domestication that left no modern descendants. Each of these findings individually would have shaken Soviet-era interpretations to their roots. Collectively, they have rewritten the prehistory of Eurasia. Isotopic tooth analysis on Arzhan 1 horses revealed long-distance tribute networks. Micro-CT analysis confirmed that the Teshik Tash horn arrangement was deliberate. Infrared photography revealed an additional 30% of the Pazyryk chief's tattooed surface area. Forensic reanalysis confirmed Pazyryk trepanation methodology. Bioarchaeological reanalysis of Arzhan 1 retainers confirmed sacrificial killing. Reanalysis of Cucuteni Trypillia, burned house remains, revealed trapped humans. Joint Polish-Mongolian, German-Russian, and American-Kazakh collaborative projects have re-excavated sensitive sites. Western journal accessibility for Russian researchers since the 1990s has accelerated the integration. The Hermitage Museum has gradually opened the Pazyryk material to international study. Soviet territory prehistoric evidence has been recognized as central, not peripheral, to world prehistory. What these 8 buried atrocities collectively reveal about prehistoric humanity contradicts the sanitized picture that Soviet ideology preferred. Neanderthals were burying their children with ritual care 70,000 years ago. Bronze Age chiefs were conducting industrial-scale animal and human sacrifice 5,000 years ago. Neolithic megacities in Eurasia were burning themselves to the ground every 2 generations for 1,500 years. The Scythian tattooing, embalming, and sacrifice tradition extended deep into Iron Age elite culture. The chariot warfare complex emerged from steppe innovation, not from Near Eastern civilization. The mammoth hunting cultures of late Pleistocene Eurasia drove megafaunal populations toward collapse. The North Caucasus produced sophisticated metallurgical and exchange networks 6,000 years ago. Horse domestication and industrial slaughter co-emerged in Kazakhstan 5,000 years ago. The cumulative picture is that organized violence is not a recent invention of historical civilizations. Ritual killing, retainer sacrifice, and mass slaughter have deep Pleistocene and Holocene roots. Soviet ideology preferred a sanitized prehistory of harmonious primitive communism, but the actual prehistoric record shows complex symbolic violence, elite competition, and ecological destruction reaching back tens of thousands of years. Violence and ritual emerge together. Hierarchy and sacrifice predate cities. Humans have always reshaped their environments through killing. The lesson for archaeological practice itself is the most uncomfortable. Ideology distorts interpretation everywhere, not just under totalitarian regimes. Current archaeological controversies are still shaped by national, religious, and political pressures. The ongoing work of integrating Soviet territory prehistoric evidence into world archaeology is not yet complete. The bones from these sites are still being reanalyzed, the DNA still being sequenced, the artifacts still being reinterpreted. The atrocities of prehistoric Eurasia were buried twice. First by the people who committed them, in earth and stone and ash, then by the Soviet scientists who unearthed them and could not, or would not, say what they had found. The bones were always speaking. What changed was whether anyone was permitted to hear them.